Hello and welcome to the Swinging Christies, the podcast about Agatha Christie in the swinging 60s. My name's Dr. Mark Aldridge, I'm an associate professor, and I research and write about Agatha Christie a lot, including in my book, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World.
And I'm Gray Robert Brown. I'm a writer and a Christie fanatic. So when we say the 1960s, you think sex, you think drugs, you think rock and roll, but you probably don't think Agatha Christie. Well, you should, because Christie wrote persistently throughout the 1960s, and much of her writing has much to say about the big topics of the day. Over the following episodes, dropping every 3 weeks on Sundays, we're going to be taking each of the era's big topics in turn and looking at Christie's work through the lens of what was a turbulent and fascinating period of British history. So this is just a little intro episode to let us settle in and set out our stall, really. Hi. Where did your love of Agatha Christie begin, Mark Aldridge?
Gray, Robert Brown. We were talking about this just before we started recording, because I said I get asked this question quite a lot and I've got a stock answer. I'm not sure it's even true because it becomes the sort of myth, doesn't it? But yeah, definitely my mum is still a big Agatha Christie fan, and she had pretty much the full set of Agatha Christie novels, but not quite the full set. So that was a big influence, just them being around. But we used to watch them on TV. That was a big introduction. We loved watching Poirot. I remember that Poirot was on too late for me, and so Mum used to tape it. I could watch it the next day after school.
You're stealing my answer. That was my answer.
Oh, but it's true. It's true. But I just was always, I was a really big reader. I read more as a child than I read now, embarrassingly. I just read a lot, and I honestly don't remember the first Agatha Christie I read. The first one I read cover to cover, I know, as short stories, was Problem at Pollenza Bay.
No.
I know, can you imagine?
With all of them.
Yeah, next to a dog and stuff in it. Just because Mum had been given it, I think, as a Christmas present, like the paperback. So it was there.
That was published in the 90s,
yeah,
isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the beginning of the 90s.
Not to age you, of course.
Thank you. So I remember reading that, but I must have read stuff before that, because that wouldn't have been my first, but I can't really remember much. But the other thing is that I'm from South Devon originally, and my family is still there. And of course, Agatha Christie is from Torquay, and so I always used to give that as a reason. And I think that's absolute nonsense. I don't think that's got anything to do with it. Because Torquay does loads now for Agatha Christie. There's a festival every year, and there's the Agatha Christie Mile. But when I was young, there was nothing. There was an exhibition in 1990 for the centenary, and I remember we didn't go to main events, but we went to the museum a little while later, and Mum picked up this paper bookmark that they were giving away for free. And it listed all of the Agatha Christie novels on it. But they were sort of wrong. Like, I think had some American titles on it, and they weren't quite right. But in the pre-internet age, that was like, Mum carried it around for like more than 10 years to finish off her set of... Because you didn't have access to a list of all of the books. So you'd have in the books, other titles available, but not a comprehensive one. So it took us ages to work out that some of those titles were wrong, and that Mum already had them. But then I wrote about screen histories and stuff, and early TV and various things. And I deliberately didn't do Agatha Christie because I love Agatha Christie, and there's nothing like killing your love for something, like making it into a job.
And yet here we are.
It got to about 2013, and I was like, why has nobody written a book about like the history of Agatha Christie screen adaptations? There'd been like guides and things like Peter Haining's book. So, but then I wrote Agatha Christie on screen just because I really wanted to do it. And Matthew Pritchard, Agatha's grandson, was so supportive of it. He was really supportive of it as an enterprise because they were quite keen to have their guide.
Well, it's a great slice of the history of the family, and
people really were interested in it. And it hasn't stopped since. So here we are now, however many years later. What about you though, Gray? What kicked it off for you?
I'm furious because you've essentially word for word stolen my answer to this question, and it's amazing how similar. Because we, for the listener, I should say, we didn't actually discuss at length what we were going to say in this section before going into this, and it is amazing how similar our stories are because. Just like you, my mum was a big Christie fan. Shout out to the mums. And in fact, fun fact for you, my mum was born on the same day as the UK edition of The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side was released.
So sweet.
Which is, of course, one of the books we're going to be looking at. So that's really cool. But yeah, she's amazing. And she had almost the full set. And I'm interested that you said your mum had almost the full set because we had one book missing. And I'm not a little cliffhanger for everyone. I'm not going to tell you which book it was because it will become relevant in the series. But yeah, she had the full set. And I remember kind of looking at the spines and looking at the titles. I don't think I actually read any of them until a certain age. And then what changed was, or maybe I read one or two, and I was aware that, you know, there'd be like Albert Finney would be on at the weekend in the background kind of thing, playing Poirot or whatever. So I was kind of aware of it. And then now we're both big fans of Christie. We're also big Doctor Who fans, both of us. And when David Tennant met Agatha Christie in 2008,
a historical fact.
A historical fact that her disappearance all came down to a giant wasp. That really changed things for me because I remember sitting and watching that with my mum, and they did that thing where they put the book titles in the dialogue. So they were going, you know, Murder at the Vicar's Rage. And we were going, it's Murder at the Vicarage. They're saying that. How funny. So, and I, because of years of looking at those spines of those old kind of fontanas that mum had on the shelves, I knew. So that got me more interested, and I went away and read loads of the books, and I started watching the Suchet series. Like you say, at that point I was old enough to stay up and watch the Suchet series and the McEwan series. And then when I got to A-level, I wanted to write my A-level essay for English about, and again, we haven't talked about this in advance, so I don't know if you're going to be shocked by this. I wanted to write about the homoeroticism between Hercule Poirot and his psychic Captain Hastings.
Wow.
And my English teacher at the time, a lovely woman called Mrs. Carter Tabasso, said, I'll just have to check with the examiner.
No.
And
the examiner was like, it's fine, they're gay.
No,
you can do it.
Not because the barrier to entry was not the gay thing. The barrier to entry was the examiner came back and said, I'm sorry, but Agatha Christie is not literary enough to write about at this level. And I wasn't allowed to do it. I had to write about Picture of Dorian Gray instead. So, and I think that really rankled with me. And I remember, and I think I sort of held on to that. So then when I got to undergrad dissertation, I then almost to prove a point made a third of my dissertation about Agatha Christie. And by that point I did an amazing detective fiction module with an incredible academic called Dr. Sian Harris, who was really kind of formative, like great lecturer. And she actually introduced me to our mutual friend, Jamie Bernthal, who then got me into the kind of Christie academic circles. And that's how you and I met. And here we are. And then you came to me with this idea, Christie in the 1960s.
Yes.
Tell me why.
So yeah, I'd had this idea for a while because I've done quite a lot of things like documentaries and stuff where people ask you about her. And I'd noticed that almost always it was the same topics coming up time and time again. So it was their big hitter titles in the 1930s, you know, Murder on the Orient Express, and then there were none and so on. Or it was her disappearance, which people always want to speak to you about. And I was thinking there's just so much of her career that we don't really talk about. And particularly, I've always found her 1960s stuff really, really interesting because in the 1960s, she is continuing to write. And I think a lot of people who aren't Agatha Christie fans but know of her are quite surprised when they learn that she's still writing in the 1960s. Because they've seen these adaptations and stuff, which are always set pretty much in the 1930s, maybe 40s or 50s. But very rarely set, you know, in the 1960s. And she was still writing up until the 1970s. She didn't die until January 1976. What a life, to be born in 1890 and die in 1976.
Yeah.
What things you've experienced, how society has changed. And so the idea is that I think that the way she talks about the 1960s is really interesting. I think people might be surprised as we go through about the way that she talks about changes in society. We were talking about the fact that there's not really a traditional country house mystery, for example, which most people would associate with Agatha Christie. It doesn't happen at all in the 1960s. And arguably, the 1960s is actually her commercially most successful decade. Her books were selling more and more each year. Every year it was pretty much beating the record of. So it's like she was so popular, but nobody really talks about them. So I thought there's loads to say, it's a really diverse decade for her. So there's a lot to discuss. And I knew that I wanted this to be a project of some kind. I didn't know what. And this is our sort of opener.
And I was already kind of interested in the back half of Christie's career because, so the dissertation I mentioned before was about 3 crime writers' final works, one of whom was, of course, Christie. And actually that dissertation I then adapted for a paper at the Golden Age of Crime Conference 2022. Yeah, and part of that kind of study, the thing that really interested me was this idea of late style, which it comes from Edward Said. It's about how a writer's kind of imperfections, their rough edges in their later work, when they're coming to the end of an impressive and lengthy career, are actually, it's those imperfections that are worth celebrating, and they're inherently fascinating. And also, I guess I had this bugbear about middle-aged or elderly women writers like Christie, like my other favourite, Muriel Spark, who kind of either forgotten or at best disregarded or at worst actually derided by our wider popular literary culture. The amazing Christie scholar Alison Light has that quote about people thinking of Christie as a kind of bucolic old lady. And that's really what we're kind of challenging here. So much, as we'll explore, so much in those works are remarkably kind of modern and fresh. And the 60s in Britain were a fascinating time. The Cold War was raging in the shadows throughout. We had culture wars like today along very similar lines, with youth movements and great inequality and turbulence in the government. And there were new media and new music and new drugs and new rights. It was a time of a really fascinating kind of Anglo-American cultural exchange as well. The ongoing disintegration of the British Empire. All this stuff that Christie does engage with. And I would argue, actually, almost always, I think she's actually not being a grumpy conservative as we might think of her. We're defining the 1960s for this project broadly as 1959 to 1970. So just peeking into the 2 decades either side for reasons that will become apparent in terms of what Christie's work in that time is talking about. There's some debate with historians about when the kind of 60s, when you can kind of really demark that. Jonathan Green has this quote about the 60s being much more a state of mind as a chronological concept. And obviously not everything that's 60s-ish finished on the 31st of December 1969. And I should say the backbone of this study that we've consulted at great length were Dominic Sandbrook, the historian's excellent 2 books, Never Had It So Good, which covers the period 1956 to 63, and then his follow-up White Heat, which is 64 to 70. And those, along with a raft of other books, have been particularly valuable. You'll hear us refer to Sandbrook a fair amount through this project, I think. All with the caveat that, not everyone was taking LSD and going on protests. And actually the 60s were much more, in the same way that we're going to be incredibly nuanced with the way we look at Christie, we're also going to strive to be really nuanced with the way we define the 60s. So yeah, a fascinating time and fascinating for Christie.
We had loads of discussions about where we're going to start and finish. So we might be a little bit flexible as we go through. But these seem to be the core titles, starting 1959, Cat Among the Pigeons, then going through the 60s with The Pale Horse, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, The Clocks, Caribbean Mystery at Bertram's Hotel, Third Girl, Endless Night by the Pricking of My Thumbs, Halloween Party, And then what an extravaganza to finish with, Passenger to Frankfurt, taking us up to 1970, which I haven't reread yet. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing if I read it this time round.
I finished it yesterday and we have a lot to talk about.
Good. But it's not just the novels. We're also going to be talking about short stories and not necessarily just the obvious ones. So we're going to look at The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding and The Mystery of the Spanish Chest, which were the two that she substantially rewrote for the 1960 Christmas Pudding collection. But we're also going to look at Star Over Bethlehem, which nobody talks about, and it's got some really interesting things. It is, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it was published under the name Agatha Christie Mallowan, and it is a collection of short stories and poems, and also the Harlequin tea set, which actually was first published in 1971, but you're pretty sure from context that it was written a few years earlier. We don't have a definitive date for that.
Yeah, and then in terms of plays?
Yeah, I mean, 50s was a really big era for her for plays, but 60s she still had some. So there's Go Back for Murder, which was a Poirot-less adaptation of Five Little Pigs. Rule of Three, which is 3 one-act plays. They're really interesting, and I'd love to see them in a revival, actually. There's also a couple of plays that were never performed that we think might well be worth discussing. So there's a play called Miss Perry, which we'll talk about later, I won't go into now, and also Deathbeat, which Agatha Christie didn't write, but she was partially collaborated on, which was a musical adaptation of Hickory Dickory Dock with Poirot removed. And that is a gold mine for working out how the 60s and Agatha Christie came together. But again, sadly, never performed.
And adaptation-wise, in the film world?
Well, 1960s is a big era for movies because it's the infamous for Agatha Christie MGM deal at the beginning of the decade, which leads to the Margaret Rutherford movies. So Margaret Rutherford playing Miss Marple in Murder, She Said, Murder at the Gallop, Murder Most Foul, and then Murder Ahoy, no exclamation mark.
You and this exclamation
me and
mark.
this exclamation, no exclamation mark, Murder Ahoy, no comma, and Murder She Said. You're thinking of Murder She Wrote.
Oh no, I do that.
Yeah,
stop
it.
No.
Stop it.
I've done that in all the notes for this podcast. Oh no.
I've removed them as I've been going
wow.
through.
Wow. Okay, I'm so sorry.
There's also a 1965 film of And Then There Were None, which is glorious in its 60s-ness. And there's also, I don't know how much we'll have to say about it, but just to acknowledge that Agatha Christie did write her own film adaptation. Not of her work, but of Dickens' Bleak House. Which I spent 10 years writing an article about, so we will crowbar that in.
No, I think it's very relevant because there's also this really interesting moment in that kind of Victorian revivalism, and actually I think there's going to be something to say with that.
But there's also this whole thing about Agatha Christie looking backwards as well as seeing a changing society and fitting into that. So there's a really interesting sort of contrast there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of spoilers, so each episode we're going to put a kind of list of solutions revealed, we're calling it, which we've cribbed completely from John Curran, Christie expert. Sorry, John. We're going to put that in the episode descriptions for each episode, wherever you get your podcasts. So if you don't want to know how that particular title ends, then maybe skip that episode for the time being. And also, just as a point of admin, we're going to put trigger warnings in the episode descriptions as well, just because some of the topics we're going to touch on might be distressing to some listeners, so have a cursory glance at those.
But the point is, we keep calling it the Swinging Christies as a project, and it's a project. This podcast is our opening conversation about it, really. An introduction to some of the key elements, some of the things that we really want to discuss. We're going to be breaking it down by topic, but really the big thing is that we want people listening to be part of that conversation and hopefully help to make this project grow at the end of our sort of initial run. We've got loads of things that we still want to do on this topic. So do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you, both on Twitter and Instagram. You can find us at Christie_time. And if you want to email us, then the email address is theswingingchristies@gmail.com.
Yeah, and then I'm on Twitter/X at... I forgot! Classic_Graham.
And I'm at Dr. Mark Aldridge on Twitter and Instagram and Threads.
And obviously, modesty will prevent you from cheekily plugging your books here, Mark. But I will do it for you. So the aforementioned excellent Agatha Christie on Screen is out now. There's also your kind of compendium on Poirot, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the greatest detective in the world. That's out in paperback, ebook, and audio.
That's correct.
And even more excitingly, your follow-up, Agatha Christie's Marple, which I've been lucky enough to read already, and I'm super excited for it to hit the bookshelves. That is available to pre-order now.
And that's it for our introductory episode. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow, thanks for listening. That's so groovy of you. The Swinging Christies is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 11th of August 2023. Our artwork was designed by Bartlett Studio, and our music is by Dar Golan.
So, it's time to exchange our presents. It's
not an
a
exchange.
podcast opening.
It's not an exchange if I don't have a present for you, but you have a present for me.
So I found last night when I was getting everything prepared. It's a genuinely wrapped present.
I'm doing some Foley so that you can tell, listener.
I was found on my shelf this, which I have no memory of purchasing. So it's a free present if I don't remember paying for it. And I just took it off the shelf thinking, what on earth is that? And I knew that this was your favourite from this era.
Oh my God.
And it's a 60s edition, and it just looks so 60s, and I loved it.
Oh, wow. For the listener, all I can see so far is a horrified face. The clocks. Wow, this is beautiful. We'll put a photo of this on the Instagram.
It's a book club edition, so it's like there are millions of them around. It's not rare. But it's got this lovely bright colours and this sort of screaming woman's face.
Yeah, with the kind of terrifying gloves over her face as well.
It's sort of like a bit of Hollywood glamour to it. And the background almost feels a bit sort of psychedelic with all those.
Yeah,
clocks.
no, very much. Very much. You can imagine having a right trip looking at that, actually.
So you have a job, which is by the end of the podcast, I want you to have found something for me that you think is equally
60s, equally swinging. Okay.
So I want you to be on the lookout for the most swinging Christie's thing you can find.
I will rise to that challenge. Thank you very much. How kind.
Oh.